1. The attacks of September 11, 2001. In her book Messages, Signs, Visits, and Premonitions from Loved Ones Lost on 9/11, the widow of a victim of the September 11, 2001 attacks declared that many victims had premonitions on the subject of this murderous day. Her husband had vertigo the morning of the attacks while on his way to work. And well before the 11th of September, he often said he didn't see himself living beyond the year 2001. He even spent an entire family reunion talking about the possibility of an attack on the World Trade Center towers, and ways to evacuate them. 2. The sinking of the Titanic. In 1898, writer Morgan Robertson published the novella The Wreck of the Titan, which tells the story of the sinking of a cruise ship. He described how the lack of rescue boats meant many passengers were unable to evacuate. His description strangely resembled the events that took place during the sinking of the Titanic on April 15, 1912, 14 years after the publication of the novella by Morgan Robertson. When he published his novella, the Titanic didn't even exist yet. 3. El Aquila earthquake. Early in 2009, researcher Gianpaolo Giuliani announced that an earthquake would hit Italian city El Aquila on Sunday, March 29 of that year. Although nothing happened on that day, 1 week later on April 6, the city was destroyed by an earthquake rated 6.3 on the magnitude scale, causing the death of 308 residents. Still, the scientific community maintains that it isn't possible to predict earthquakes in the short term. Gianpaolo Giuliani himself continues to insist that radon 222 gas emissions indicate an earthquake will occur within days. He is still the only person to maintain this. 4. Sharon Tate's premonition. Actress Sharon Tate had hallucinations a few months before she was murdered by Charles Manson. The then wife of director Roman Polanski stated that she saw her own body assassinated and prostrate in her home. In 1969, Manson killed her in her Los Angeles residence, while 8 months pregnant. 5. Abraham Lincoln's murder. Abraham Lincoln had several premonitions regarding his own death. A few days before he was killed, the 16th President of the United States told his bodyguard about a dream he had had. He said he saw himself walking toward the White House until he met a group of tearful people and a body surrounded by soldiers. When Abraham Lincoln, in his dream, asked the soldier who the lifeless person was, the soldier told him it was the President of the United States who had just been assassinated. 6. The Gulf of Mexico disaster. The movie Knowing, released in 2009 starring Nicolas Cage, begins with a premonition that the scriptwriters couldn't have predicted. It shows Nicolas Cage's character drinking a beer while watching the news on TV. The news describes an explosion on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. 1 year later, on April 20, 2010, a nearly identical headline announced that an explosion occurred on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, causing one of the region's greatest environmental disasters. 7. A tiger attack. The scriptwriters of the cartoon The Simpsons succeeded not only in obtaining huge ratings, but also predicting a major event before it occurred. In 1993, an episode featured a tiger attack against tamers, Gunther and Ernst, who are in fact caricatures of the illusionists Siegfried and Roy. The two were quite popular in Las Vegas for their shows wherein they had tigers disappear before the audience. In 2003, a tiger attacked Roy, putting an end to the duo's career. 8. Poltergeist announced the death of an actress. In the horror movie Poltergeist, one element surprised fans of the movie. 6 years later, Robbie, a little boy in the Freeling family, had a poster above his bed advertising the Super Bowl of the year 1988, which is strange for a movie that was meant to take place in 1982. But what's most shocking is that on the day of the Super Bowl in 1988, the actress Heather O'Rourke, who played one of Robbie's sisters, died after suddenly becoming ill. 9. The Boston Marathon attack. In an episode from the animated series Family Guy, Peter Griffin's character talks about his performance at the Boston Marathon. He said he just got in his car, started the engine, and since there was someone on the road, he knocked them down. The episode aired on March 17, 2013, a month before the Boston Marathon was hit with an attack, on April 15. 10. The first nuclear attack. In 1913, author H.G. Wells wrote The World Set Free, a novel forewarning the use of the atomic bomb. At the time, scientists knew considerable energy could be released, but they still didn't know how. Wells was the first to envision the chain reaction that could be produced by nuclear fission. The attacks in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, 32 years later, confirmed his idea. 11. Mars to Moons. In 1735, author Jonathan Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels. While there was no proof of it at the time, he gave the planet Mars 2 moons in his story. It wasn't until 1877, 142 years later, that American astronomer Asaph Hall observed the presence of the 2 natural satellites around the red planet. 12. A rocket ship. In 1865, in his work From the Earth to the Moon, French author Jules Verne imagined that a rocket was launched from Florida to transport a machine destined to land on the Moon. The machine was then meant to return to our planet. It was 104 years before the Apollo 11 mission, which allowed the first human to set foot on the Moon and return safe and sound, like the heroes imagined by Jules Verne. 13. An electric submarine. In 1870, Jules Verne also imagined a submarine fueled by electric energy. It was in his book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Captain Nemo was running the Nautilus, a submarine able to move on its own thanks to an entirely electric engine. It took 90 years for fiction to become a reality. The American submarine USS Nautilus was the first to propel itself using only electric energy, more specifically, nuclear energy. 14. The First World War. Polish financier Jan Gottlieb Bloch not only was the pioneer for railroads in his country, but also carefully studied the consequences a war that would destroy Europe could have. He wrote 6 books, published in 1898, in which he describes the transformation of modern warfare. In his opinion, the next big European war would be a war of trenches due to the evolution of weaponry. The next war would be more murderous, affecting millions of victims. And the war would be accompanied by famine and epidemics, he stated. 16 years later, the First World War was declared and confirmed all of Bloch's predictions. 15. Air conditioning. In December 1900, an American engineer by the name of John Elfreth Watkins, Jr. published an article in the women's magazine of the Saturday Evening Post. In his article titled, What May Happen in the Next 100 Years, Watkins discussed the idea that his great-grandchildren from the end of the 20th century would be able to cool off thanks to air conditioning. According to him, air conditioning would be available in houses as was hot and cold water in 1900, through taps filled with cold air. 16. The globalization of commerce. Watkins also predicted that commercial exchanges would increase dramatically at the end of the 20th century. He described refrigerated vehicles that could transport fruit from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, allowing consumers from northern countries to eat fruit all year round. 17. The death of Alexander the Great. Upon returning from his expedition in India, in 325 BC, Alexander the Great brought great satisfaction to Kalanos, a Hindu ascetic who was returning to Europe with him. The old man requested to be killed, as he was exhausted. On the stake, before dying, Kalanos told Alexander the Great they would see each other again in Babylon. The great king hadn't planned on going to Babylon at the time. Yet, Alexander did end up dying in Babylon, 2 years later, at the age of 32. 18. The Second World War. In 1917, as the First World War came to an end, 3 sisters from the Portuguese city of Fatima declared they saw an apparition of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary told them that a huge sign in the night would arrive before a Second World War. On January 25, 1938, an immense aurora appeared in the sky in Europe. The glow was so great that it could be seen from Africa and America. 6 weeks later, the annexation of Austria into Germany took place and the Second World War became inevitable. 19. Cholera in Cuba. In 2012, a cholera epidemic hit Cuba for the first time in 50 years. Authorities were surprised by the disease outbreak. Yet, Eric Horvitz, managing director at Microsoft Research, and Kara Radinsky, researcher at the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology, say they predicted the epidemic. They had compiled various sources, including articles from the New York Times, and integrated them into their mathematical model. 20. The liberation of Indonesia. Nearly 900 years ago, the king of Java, called Jayabaya, stated that his kingdom would be dominated by white men for 3 centuries before being run by Asians for a very short period of time. The Netherlands would conquer the kingdom during the 1600s. In 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, the Japanese landed, welcomed jubilantly by the residents who were certain they were seeing Jayabaya's prophecy come true. 3 years later, Japan surrendered to the United States and abandoned what became an independent Indonesia.